Welcome back to the Caribbean Linked 6 Black Box Artist Talks. Many thanks for those of you who have tuned in, and gratitude to our sponsors and the co-founders of Caribbean Linked, Atelier 89, Fresh Milk Barbados, and ARC for making this all possible. It is my honor and joy to introduce you to my longtime sister in the trenches, Annalie. Annalie Davis's hybrid practice is a visual artist, cultural instigator, and writer. Her work sits at the intersection of biography and history on post-plantation economies by engaging with a particular landscape of Barbados. Her studio, located on a working dairy farm that operated historically as a 17th century sugar plantation, offers a critical context for her practice. Drawing, walking, making bush teas, and growing living apothecaries, Annalie Davis's practice suggests future strategies for repair and thriving while investigating the role of botanicals and living plots as sites of refusal, counter-knowledge, community, and healing. Annalie is currently exhibiting a group show, Vanishing Lines in Venezuela. Recent exhibitions include Staple, What's on Your Plate?, an inaugural show at Hey Jamil in Jeddah, and If I Devoted My Life to One of Its Feathers at the Kunsthal Wine in Austria, and potential agrarianisms. There will be Sugar After the Rebellion at the Kunsthal Bratislava in Slovakia. Her upcoming solo exhibition, A Hymn to the Banished, opens next month at the Stedlands Gallery in the Highlands of Scotland as a part of a year-long commission for the National Trust of Scotland, exploring historic links between Scotland and Barbados. She is currently working on a living apothecary for the Sharjah Biennale, opening in February of 2023. Welcome, Annalie.
Thank you so much, Yawo, for the introduction. It's always good to be here in Aruba and at the Atelier 89. And of course, we can never express enough gratitude to Elvis for hosting the 6th edition of Caribbean Linked, to Margriet and Gerrit in the Netherlands, who are angels based there, for their ongoing support. And of course, to the admin team on the ground, Lupita, Chrislyn, and Catherine, whose attention to detail and caring labor is so very much appreciated. While the focus of my talk tonight is going to be on my art practice and not the activism work, Caribbean Linked is a very special project in my heart. And I often say that what I've loved most over the last 10 years is seeing how all of you, the resident artists who are here this year and those who have come before, you arrive in Aruba as separate islands and you leave as an archipelago. And that is a very beautiful thing to witness over and over again. Being here makes me feel very reflective because I'm reminded of my first trip to Aruba in 1991. I was asking Elvis if he could find a picture of us from back then, but the archive is so old that we can't locate it. I was in my late 20s at that time, like many of you. I made the decision to return to the Caribbean, and I started teaching at secondary school and then at the tertiary level institution. And I know for many of you live on small islands, it can feel very isolating to be working as a contemporary practitioner. And I decided that I needed to start meeting my contemporaries around the region. There was not a Caribbean Linked at that time. So I kind of developed my own little Caribbean Linked in a way. And that, you know, coming to Aruba was important because I hadn't been to the Dutch Caribbean before and started meeting my peers. the year after, I co-founded something called Representing Artists, which was a union for artists in Barbados. It was short-lived, but it feels like the child that became Fresh Milk in many ways in 2011. And that interweaving of cultural activism and my art practice has been critical for a very long time, feeling that we can go forward faster if we do that together. And I know from some of the initial discussions I've had with some of the residents here and from listening to the Black Box talks, that this notion or question of how we relate to the nation state, how we relate to the about coming back to our countries and to remaining in the Caribbean is a challenging one. And I think that that connects with this, what my work is very much focused on is the plantation, and that some of these challenges around exclusion and inclusion, hierarchy, who belongs, who doesn't, notions of knowing your place is very much connected to the plantation. So I think what I'm going to start by doing is showing a short video that will give a sense of where I'm working and how my practice is situated. I think I've got this right. I was raised in the countryside. When I was a young child, I thought of it as a natural environment. I spent my formative years moving from one rural environment to another, and later understood that these landscapes, rather than being natural terrain, were perfectly manicured plantations, where varieties of sugarcane were carefully bred and planted in 5-foot by 5-foot plots in plowed fields. 1,742 cane holes were planted per acre. There wasn't anything natural about the plantation. Since the early 17th century, this land has been deforested, mapped, farmed, and under surveillance as Britain's first sugar isle. Those actions, under the guise of empire, expansion, and progress, contributed to what is now understood as the birthplace of the Anthropocene or the Plantationocene, the era of environmental transformation and climate collapse. What was once understood as a passive space has transformed. The lands are now showing agency, rupture, and abundance. I try to listen to it with another ear, and I wonder if we listen to it more carefully, what we might hear and what we might learn about it and about ourselves. My work straddles biography and history, focusing on post-plantation economies by engaging with this particular landscape here in St. George, Barbados, where I've been located for the last 20 years. It was a former 17th century sugar plantation and converted to a dairy farm more than 35 years ago. I'm interested in drawing lines on paper, interfering with lines on ledger pages, forming lines that connect this time to that time. My practice recognizes the need to draw new lines, refusing to accept that all lines have already been drawn. The Wild Plant series acknowledges the agency of wild botanicals growing in former sugarcane fields. I once saw them as weeds, but I later understood their medicinal value. Grown and cared for by enslaved Africans, used in Afro-syncretic spiritual practices for healing, these plants shaped identity in slave societies. I now see these plants as active agents in the process of healing the soil, re-emerging centuries later to assert themselves against the backdrop of a dying sugar industry. When I walk the fields, I find porcelain and ceramic shards in the soil, which I've incorporated into the work called Bush Tea Services. And from this project, I have served bush tea made with cerci, lemongrass, blue vervain, and bay leaf, while engaging in dialogue about British-Barbadian historic relations. I was surprised when speaking with London-based participants by their lack of understanding regarding our shared history and how the landscape was transformed by the colonial project to modernize their society. How could they not recognize us after so many centuries of entanglement? Bush Tea Plots, a decolonial patch, is a permanent intervention located at the University of the West Indies in Barbados. It references small plots of land given to the enslaved people where they grew food and medicine, took care of themselves and of each other, becoming important sites of tradition, healing, and ritual. The plot was a creative pre-capitalist site located within the larger capitalist colonial machinery of the plantation. It resisted the dynamic of the plantation and became a space for the creative imaginary, the nurturing of spirit and of memory. My current commission is developing an apothecary at Walker's Reserve in St Andrew. It's located in the Scotland district. It's called the Garden of Hope, and it's located on what was the 17th century sugar plantation. It then converted about 50 years ago into another kind of extractive economy. It was a silica sand quarry, and that's now going through another transition to become a permaculture site. The Garden of Hope is dedicated to indentured women, invisible women who eked out a living in the harsh landscape of the Scotland district, as well as the women and girls who were listed in the 19th century slave registry for walkers. And that living apothecary is going to include plants that will focus on women's reproductive and post-reproductive health. It will have plants that will be used for a general first aid kit. And the apothecary will sit within the larger, hopeful vision of a post-plantation regenerative landscape. Thank you. This first project that I'm going to speak about is called Unearthing Voices, and it's a collaboration I've been engaged with since 2016 with a New York-based archaeologist, Dr. Matthew Riley. I'm particularly interested in trying to unpack the plantation in multiple ways because it's what has shaped Barbados and the wider Caribbean and continues to have an impact today. The documents I have access to where I live, wills and conveyances and deeds, are usually from the voice of the white male planter. And what I'm trying to do through this archaeological program, which includes summer field sessions with students that come from CUNY University in New York, many of whom are first generation Caribbean students, is to see if we can find the site of an enslaved village and to tell other kinds of narratives about this site. This is this summer's field session, which ended on Monday. We currently have about 5,000 artifacts that have been kind of analyzed and sorted and labeled, and they sit in the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. And it's an ongoing relationship which has become very important as one way of bringing local community into the digs over the last number of years. Just, I think, a way of combining or working interdisciplinarily to understand the space in collaboration. Some of these shards I have used in my work. This piece is called F is for Frances. Her name is drawn out using shards that I found in the soil. Frances was named in an 1816 will that was written by a Thomas Applewhite, who owned the site where I currently live. And he referred to her as his favorite girl slave, which seemed kind of oxymoronic to me, and that how could you put these two words together? I was told by the director, deputy director of the museum, that the term favorite at that time was a code for lover. And he wrote about her more than he wrote about anyone else in the will. He required that his granddaughters would take care of her, and he left £10 a year in the church for them to allow her to buy clothes, and he offered her manumission 6 years after his death. These drawings of her name are on ledger pages, plantation ledger pages, which I've worked with since 2016. And I'm interested in them because they suggest a certain kind of order, and they tell the story of Barbados through economic means. And I'm trying to insert other narratives and objects into the plantation ledger page to speak about the gaps in history and the need for other narratives to come forward. Interested in thinking about the landscape and seeing the soil as witness, soil as tomb, soil as a regenerative material. Sweeping the Fields is the documentation of a kind of a performative work using a cocoyer broom and moving through in this kind of act of reconciliation, cleansing. These images are taken at the Kunsthalle Bratislava for the Potential Agrarianisms exhibition. The Parasite series was inspired by a Cuban essayist called Antonio Benitez Rojo. He wrote a critical text about the Caribbean island, and he spoke about Caribbean history was akin to a long annelid parasite that was moving in the bowels of the region, which to me was an incredible kind of idea around the extractive history that the Caribbean, this is what our history has been. Here is the image of a woman looking, kind of encountering parasites of history, this attempt at expurgating the long parasites of history from her bowels. As if the entanglements of our lives did not matter is a sequence of drawings. They were shown at the Royal Botanical Gardens, Edinburgh. These are two kind of family portraits. I'll speak a little bit about the one on the right. It's an attempt at bringing a that wasn't allowed really to be together. I often think that empire ruined intimacy and fostered madness. People weren't allowed to really love across race and class. And the woman in the red dress came from a very poor sort of background. Her mother was a seamstress. Her father was a grocer. And she fell in love with this man who was biracial, born in 1870, and they had a young child. Weren't allowed to live together, and the young child was given to a spinster aunt. And there's a parasite coming out of her dress, and then they're included with these plants that have the capacity to kind of remove parasites, to cleanse the skin. And they're shown in, so this is a portrait to be together, and I've kind of brought them together. The little girl on the chair is my maternal grandmother, who was really, formed with a profound sense of shame about her illegitimacy and, the inability to access to a family. And I think that this is really what the plant has done in its sense of division and notions around who belongs and who doesn't. Alongside the two portraits are a series of drawings, again on ledger pages, with plants that have different kinds of healing properties. Maybe they remove toxins from the blood, they clean, they deal with skin conditions, they deal with a broken heart. So they're these plants that have been used within small plots that was referred to in the little video that I showed before. And the curator, Emma Nicholson, pulled plants from their archive and placed them into the vitrine, some of the plants which were included in the drawings. This work is Kerr's diary, an effort at disalienation. It's installed, well, it's currently actually at the show in Caracas, but this image is taken from the Kunsthalle Bratislava. And it was really an effort for me to think about how do we form a relationship with a landscape that has been so heavily mediated by centuries of the plantation, colonization, and more recently tourism. How do you even begin to connect with soil where the footprint of so continues to be so evident, certainly in the case of Barbados. So again, I'm working on these ledger pages that are daily record analysis sheets from an abandoned sugar factory. And what I'm doing is, instead of kind of thinking about this objective way of recording information that is scientifically accurate, it's a very subjective response to the land, and I'm making notations that are very kind of personal, things that I see. And thinking a lot overseer in the history of the Caribbean. The overseer was supposedly held this objective perspective on the plantation where he could see everything. And what I'm suggesting is that we have a process of inner seeing. So there's a more subjective response to the landscape, that we're trying to form relationships with beyond the trauma that was, I guess, imposed onto the landscape through the history of the sugarcane plantation. This site at Walkers in the Scotland district on the east coast of Barbados, I'm currently working, have been working for a couple of years. It's been stalled since the COVID, but this is the site where I've been thinking about developing this small apothecary dedicated to women who lived and worked there. This living apothecary focused on women's reproductive health. It was a sugarcane converted into a sand quarry, which is closing, and it's being turned into this permaculture site. The garden is going to be going just off the edge of the building, the image on the right where the solar panels are. It's a small space, 7 by 10 meters approximately. So when you walk into this building, you'll look over the balcony onto the drawing on the right. My collaborator, Kevin Talma from Talma Mill Studios, who's a Barbadian. These interlocking organic shapes that will become for use, for research. This building here is the head office of the Caribbean Culture Research Institute. It's used for workshops, but it means then that this collection of plants can be used for some of the research that these people will be engaged with when they're there. These are drawings of plants that I've found growing on that site, and they're called, the garden is called A Garden of Hope. The drawings are called From a Garden of Hope. I'm really interested in substrates, so kind of like the plantation ledger page, these contour lines speak to the history of mapping, the way in which heavily mapped from the 17th century as a way to understand where the value is and how you can extract as much as possible from it. And in inserting other things that have been excluded for centuries, like have healing properties that a lot of that information is disappearing. How can we know more about that? So the insertion of these plants that we often overlook, that are ubiquitous in the environment, has been retained, and just trying to give some kind of more visibility to some of these plants and their value. My commission with the National Trust for Scotland, I've been working on for the past year. It's part of their Facing Our Past program, and looking at the relationship between their properties and the funding that would have come through the transatlantic slave trade. Scotland is trying more recently to address their role in the transatlantic slave trade and not to continue to further the narrative that they're victims of England. It's really interesting that, we had a number of Scottish people that came to Barbados beginning in the 17th century, but most people in Scotland are not aware of this relationship. So I've been working on 2 projects in Scotland. One is working with teenage students at Ploughton High School in the Highlands on an estate that was owned by Lord Seaforth, who was the governor of Barbados from 1800 to 1806. So there's this historic relationship between the property and Barbados, and developed 4 garden beds, 2 of which we chose for making teas, and then 1 for ritual and 1 for healing. And then I worked with a medical herbalist from the Isle of Skye, and we co-developed these 3 healing teas, which we served at the opening, and she will come back and teach the young students how to make teas using the plants that they have grown and cared for. I recently showed at CCA Glasgow. It was a two-person exhibition with Scotland-based Amanda Thompson. It was called Lightly Tendrils. I've been thinking a lot about incantations and charms in the work for Scotland. Gaelic healers in the Highlands used incantations and charms, and Afro-Barbadian communities within the enslaved society also used incantations and charms. And I was thinking about the ways in which these two groups of people might have rubbed up against each other and how these different systems of knowledge might have influenced their work. And so I've sort of been inspired by this use of incantations and charms, and are creating these kind of present day charms that then are kind of secular prayers that respond to the environmental crisis that we're dealing with, part of which was prompted by the plantation and what we call the Plantationocene. So the use of drift seeds that have come in on the world's ocean currents, which on the Gulf Stream of Scotland have come on to the east coast of Barbadian waters, that were used by healers, that were imbued with meaning. So these are small doilies, crocheted tea cloths onto which I have attached cyanotype plants and the lines from drawings of the maps of the Scotland district, and creating these kinds of sacred objects, these secular sacred objects that acknowledge that shared history, but also thinking about the kind of current crisis that we're living in. What's the Opposite of Erasure is a 1973 Atlas of British Flora that I found on a giveaway table at the University of the West Indies on the Cave Hill campus. And again, interested in these inherited substrates. Search for the National Trust for Scotland, out of the 2,500 Scottish people that came to Barbados, only 152 were women. And I decided that I would transcribe their names into this Atlas of British Flora, and calling the project What's the Opposite of Erasure. 15 of those women were from the Edinburgh Correction House, and there's more work that's happening on that, which will be shown at the piece that I'll share. I think it's the final piece. This is the courtyard in the biennial opens in February of next year, and it's a really beautiful space. It's called Beit Al Herma, which means the woman's house. And I'm developing a living apothecary there. So there's a glass vitrine that is growing jasmine. So the idea is that when you come in, there will be this scent, but I'm kind of Barbadian garden to Sharjah, which is not the kind of gardens that you see at the Chelsea Flower Show in England, but it's looking more at this use of wild plants and their value. And it's moving again, order of the ledger page and the order of the plantation, which is really an application of geometry. And it's offering another kind of method for growing and planting herbs and flowers and healing plants, bush medicine and bush baths, and thinking about agency of and their capacity to transform places. The interior space is then going to have a series of embroidered panels that will mirror the size of the windows, and that's very much in progress at the moment. And I think I'm done. This is an aerial shot of me walking through the landscape where I live and work. And it's, yeah, very much thinking about relating to land, transforming what happens on the landscape. And yeah, we're at a low battery on this laptop as well. So it's a good time to end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annalie, for that thrilling story and really beautiful and moving work. We'd like to open up the floor for any questions. Just raise your hand. Rena.
I think everyone always wonders why I go first, but I will forget. Like I'm like Dory from Finding Nemo, so that's why I always go like. "Ugh." But I had a question in regards to I've seen in your show that slideshow that you did, you've done a lot of cross-cultural work, and I want to know more about how for young people, what are the avenues to get into those sort of situations, and then also what is the impact that you see long term of having these sort of relationships? And do you think that the work that you're doing is doing what you want it to do?
Thanks.
Question.
Yeah, you cheat. How do you get to do those cross-cultural projects? I mean, I think the most important thing that we have is our network and our community, and forming relationships with people is where those opportunities have happened. So, for example, showing at the Royal Botanical Gardens, Edinburgh, the person who had developed this new project for the National Trust for Scotland had seen it, and she had invited me to put forward a proposal for this Facing Our Past project. So it's, I think, building community and saying yes to lots of things and collaborating with people. Being in a small island, I think that I mean, this may sound ridiculous, but the social media platforms have been so important because we don't necessarily have fully functional cultural institutions that are doing the work for us. And so we talked a little bit about that the other day, and how much we have to kind of work as activists, doing the admin and all of that stuff. What is the impact of doing that work? I kind of feel that since the Black Lives Matter moment, that narratives, I know there are some narratives that have become more entrenched and polarized, but they have also been opportunities for discussions to open up. And I feel in the case of Scotland that there have been a lot of opportunities to open up. And so I've been seeing just the interest in the part of the UK in responding to my work has generated these opportunities, and working with the students at Ploughton High School, like you can see the kind of cogs in their mind are spinning. And I feel as though working with the curators I have worked with in the institutions, that there's been real interest in the work. I think having additional programming to open up the work so that it's not like this precious white cube closed off thing, but finding ways where you can really engage with people. So doing the living apothecaries, I think, is really important. On in Sharjah, hopefully we'll be working with women gardeners there, and then developing an entire program around how to grow a garden, how to make soil, how to do composting, women's reproductive rights, post-reproductive issues, making teas, kite making for kids, cyanotype drawing, so that there are ways in which through the projects you can have these broader conversations. So I feel that I'm getting the feedback that it's working. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
Yes, I also say it before I forget, because I've been repeating it in my head. um, I'm wondering, how do you? Okay, let me go to the beginning. So I've seen that you make work out of facts. Let's say so. So you
Out of
research
what?
facts.
Facts, right.
Like going into archives, digging up actual stuff out of the ground. And I wonder, how do you go about your process from that research that is very demanding and can also take you totally into the research? So how do you can you say, okay, now it's time to stop with this research and go into the work, and how is that process for you?
Yeah, thanks for the question. When I was doing the work for the National Trust for Scotland, I spent a number of months just reading, and my work always begins with words. So there's always writing and reading and conversations with people who know more than I do about a particular subject matter. And then I got very overwhelmed by the reading I was doing, and felt that I just couldn't contain all of the information. And so I decided I would put those words to one side, and I would sort to pull on images. So a lot of the work takes a long time to think about, and then I kind of wait for a download to happen. And I kind of know at this moment, okay, there's enough, and I just trust that what I've been reading and writing and thinking about it's gonna come out in some kind of way, and I've learned to trust the process. So it can be kind of nerve-wracking, but there usually the process is reading, writing, talking, and then it's just beginning to work with the images, and it kind of falls into place. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, good night. It
Good
seems to
night.
me that there's been a sort of silence in the Anglophone islands about the role of Scotland during enslavement and even after abolition. Now, you just mentioned the Scots in Barbados. Were they settlers or indentured servants or a combination of both?
They were both. So all of the white community that came in would have comprised indentured laborers and then artisans, bookkeepers, managers, plantation owners. So Scotland also would have had bookkeepers in Barbados, and they would have had prisoners of war who came in after the Jacobite rebellion after 1745. But they were coming out, they were settlers, and I mean, at all kind of levels of that economy.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the indentured story hasn't been spoken about a lot. There was a show that just happened recently at the Ford Foundation, curated by Andil Gosain, with a number of artists dealing with Indo and Chinese kind of indentured histories. But it hasn't really been explored very much. There is a lot of silence around it, and so this is part of my interest in
Because I know a group went also to St. Vincent,
for sure.
right?
Yeah.
And same combination of
Right.
both. Okay.
Right, and they, you know, they were the Scots were very heavily present in Jamaica and Guyana. 90% of Jamaican surnames are Scottish. So yeah, it's kind of amazing that they're now facing up to that.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, all right. Two more.
Hi, Annalie.
Hi.
I found the work of yours with the parasites very intriguing, also in connection with your maternal grandmother. And I think the way I see it is like it's like an allegory in the post-colonial decay that's happening right now. And I was wondering how does it stand for you now, like with your relation with the parasite, for you personally? How is it affecting you personally?
Yeah, I mean, I think that yeah, it's a difficult history. It's a complicated history. I think the parasites that moved from the first series of drawings into the family portraits were quite challenging to do because they were very personal stories, and I can't show them in Barbados. And I wasn't aware of the extent of those kind of personal narratives until I was in my 20s. And I think the way that I guess I'm seeing it now is it's about our kind of embodied sense of who we are. There's so much trauma around that. But it's also within the history of extractivism, and incredible really on Sunday night to drive on the tourist strip here and to understand that there are 2 million tourists that come into Aruba, a population of 120,000 people, and that maybe it looks different, but there is this extreme sense of extractivism that's still happening now. So I see that parasitic kind of history is going. I'm not an economist. I don't know what the alternative models are. But I feel like we're going to hell in a handbasket at the moment. And that kind of parasitic history is continuing, like that model, even in post-colonial spaces with post-independent governments, that still is the model. So I guess, yeah, really seeing that issue ecologically is really concerning at the moment. So I guess that's where the work with plants and gardens feels like it's the most healing thing I could possibly do. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Annalie.
Hi. Hello, Catherine.
Okay. My question is around, because so much of your work is looking at shared histories and perspectives and alternate readings of spaces. I'm wondering how you kind of navigate that sensitive area in your practice along telling, unearthing the stories of others who would have had particular traumatic histories in relation to to what society in Barbados is now, and how readings of people in space along like racial lines, class lines, as you mentioned, how you navigate those kinds of issues in your work and ensure that the balance is restored one way or the other.
I don't understand, Elvis. Oh, 2 minutes. Oh, this is dead, so there's nothing I can do about that. Navigating my way through that. I feel that, so in terms of race and class, and making work that deals with this very difficult history, I feel that it's a multi-pronged kind of approach. And in part, that's why working kind of socially and as a kind of a cultural activist becomes very important. I live on the site of a former plantation. It is impossible for me. I was raised on a plantation. My father owned a plantation. It is what I think has shaped everything about who we are in the Caribbean. And I feel that I'll probably spend my life working through the complexity of what that means. There have been many difficult moments through all of that, but I feel that the commitment to continuing the practice and being vulnerable in some of that work is important. And the cultural activism and building community is a way of also addressing a lot of inequities. I mean, I come from quite a privileged background, and so that kind of work has been very important. I see, for example, fresh milk as a cultural plant that's being intervened into the site of a former plantation, that's inspired by this idea of phytoremediation, where plants can remove toxins through their root structure, and that in putting an entity like that into a plantation, which was not designed for us to commune across race and class, has been, I think, important, and also through education and trying to unlearn the plantation in myself, because, you know, I was taught by my father that these plants were weeds and they were removed either by chemicals or people. And now I understand that my ignorance around that was because our educational system didn't expose us to this richer history. So it's this kind of long, lifelong process of learning and unlearning. And yeah, that's kind of how I do it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Annalie, thank you so much for this exchange. Thank you, everyone, for your attention and just interest. It's been wonderful. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to the Black Box Talk tonight. Do remember to join us on Saturday, August 13th at 6 p.m. for our final presentation. We will be joined by Yulan Van Elfen and Steve Elbers from Vriden Lottery Funds. I hope I didn't butcher that name. Vriden, sorry, thank you, Justin. And of course, our exhibition showcasing all of the works produced during Caribbean Link 6 opens on Sunday, August 14th at 6 p.m. We invite you to come out and celebrate with us at the Atelier. See you on Saturday and hopefully on Sunday, and Benochi from the Black Box.